Hello and welcome back to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, we're breaking down the year in the comic book industry in two parts. In part one, we'll look at the state of the comic book industry as a whole, as well as what things were going on in society that may have impacted the comic book industry during that year. We'll talk big picture about what's going on at DC and independent comics. Then we'll shift our focus to Marvel. We'll look at who is creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics debuted or ended. In part two, we'll dive deep into Marvel's longest-running characters, Matt Murdock. We'll look at what the year had in store for the Man Without Fear, key things that happened, and who joined or left his world before spotlighting one key issue or story. From there, we'll wrap up the year's discussion with a takeaway before moving on to another year and a whole new discussion. We're excited to have you join us on a trip through comic book history. And we are back for another year, 1998. This one's going to be a biggie. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, this is something.
Yeah, things continue to be pretty grim in the old comic book world this year. But it does seem, as we start going through it, that the free fall itself might actually be over. Because Marvel has escaped bankruptcy without missing even a single month of publishing, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. Most of the other companies that were still in business to start the year made it through the year, although not all, of course. And we did get some interesting new players entering the scene who are going to be very important to comics' future. So, 1998's a busy year.
You also you didn't even tease it. Our man Daredevil came to an end this year. And then restarted right away again.
That's your side of things. It's not my place to spoil the Daredevil things for you.
Just talking about an overview of the year in this intro, you get to talk about Daredevil a little bit. You've done it before.
There you go.
But there it is. Daredevil does in fact succumb to the cancellation that we saw so many of the heroes get the last couple of years. But he doesn't stay gone long. As in, not at all, because his new book comes out the same month his last book comes out. So it's you don't even miss him necessarily.
There's all sorts of reasons that we could talk about for it, and we will when we get there. But yeah, we lose Daredevil, and then we get him back again. So kind of crazy.
But we've got a lot of things to talk about before we get to that, starting with the year in comics. All right, Dan, you said the free fall might be over. Where do we begin? We usually start with DC when we talk about the year in comics, if we're looking at the big picture before diving into Marvel. What do you got for us?
This year I kind of started with the movies, because there are just a couple of movie things to talk about.
Sure.
There's a few TV shows still continuing on like they have been and everything. But as far as movies, we had a very important year for Marvel, and kind of a disappointing year, or depending on how you think about it, a close, run-in with disaster for DC. So Blade was released in theaters this year.
Oh, yes.
The first Marvel property to have been licensed in a long time and actually make it to the screen. Nobody expected anything out of this movie, and it was a massive critical and financial success. And to be quite frank, it still holds up today. I watched it with my son probably 6 months ago. I love this movie.
That is the original Wesley Snipes
correct.
Blade, and that he brought back, spoilers, I guess, if you have not seen Deadpool and Wolverine, we get to see Wesley Snipes back in that role again. But this was the first movie. I never actually went and saw it, and I don't think I've actually seen the movie, but I've heard decent things about it.
I mean, it is goofy, and it is bloody, and it's crazy, but he is so cool in terms of the way he handles things, and Chris Christopherson is just great as kind of his buddy and tech guy and the like, and it's really just a good, solid movie that happens to be based on a Marvel character. And
Right.
they didn't really play that up at all. Most people
No.
who went probably had no idea that this even was a Marvel character, because Tomb of Dracula is not that popular a property. Most people had never heard of the character Blade, or would have never associated him with Marvel. He debuted in Tomb of Dracula #10 way back in the early 70s. He'd been around for a long time, but he was not an A-list character by any means.
I was going to say, I didn't remember that being a comic book movie. Like, from the marketing standpoint, that obviously now I know, but like, I don't think I would have known then, and it definitely would not have. I don't know that it would have swayed me one way or the other to go to the movie or not go to the movie at that time.
Well, I know that an awful lot of people worried about the idea that calling something a comic book movie would limit its appeal to audiences.
Sure.
That's what you had with Men in Black, kind of doing it stealthily last year. Blade, the same thing this year. We also had from DC the Superman Lives movie, which was essentially to be directed by Tim Burton, starring Nicolas Cage as Superman, and written by Kevin Smith. And it
Okay.
had all sorts of things going on and all sorts of problems, and eventually it just sort of fell apart because they couldn't get the script right, they couldn't get everything else right, and eventually Burton and Cage just sort of lost interest and wandered away. There were screen tests and the like, though, and because this was the mid-90s, Cage would have been playing the sort of long hair, sort of mulleted
The
Superman.
one that he ends up being in the Flash movie.
Yes,
Preshow.
that is
Yes.
actually, that's the 97, 98 Superman Lives sort of Superman. And it, as of this year, that finally just loses steam and goes away. Also, just as a note, we did have some, again, because there's always this stuff going on with creators' rights. Marv Wolfman actually sued Marvel and sued the studios to try and get the rights to Blade back when the movie came out and made a bunch of money. And he lost the suit, but because they said, well, you did it work for hire, and he said, I'd never signed any of that paperwork, so because of that, it's technically mine. But it's incredibly difficult to get a character back from Marvel or DC if you've put them into their comic books. So Wolfman was just the latest person to realize that when he lost his lawsuit.
Okay, so that's what's going on in the movies. What's going on, like, in comics then for DC?
DC had a busy year, had a bunch of crossovers, had a bunch of big kind of storylines. They had the DC 1 million crossover that went through a bunch of books. They had Batman's Cataclysm, which was essentially where you had Gotham City have a massive earthquake. And kind of the weird thing about it was we didn't find out in the end that it was like caused by Two-Face or something like that. It literally was just a massive earthquake that screwed everything up and caused all sorts of damage to the city. Green Lantern had the Emerald Knights storyline, where you essentially had I think it was Kyle Rayner teaming up with Hal Jordan, sort of from his pre-Parallax time. Superman for All Seasons by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale came out. That was, for a long time, one of my favorite Superman stories. Just a fantastic story. Sale's art is always just wonderful to look at. So that was a lot of fun. And then we also had an interesting story from Alex Ross. He did a Superman Peace on Earth story, which is another one of his big painted kind of one-shots that talked a little bit about Superman and almost like a Christmassy type of story. In other news, Wally West, after courting his girlfriend for years, actually got married in 1998. She then immediately disappears and is gone for 2 years or something like that in the future, or some weird dimension where he's trying to get her back. So nobody's just allowed to be happy in the DC universe.
I guess not.
It was a weird wedding in that there wasn't actually a big fight at the wedding. It's just what happened at the end was crazy.
Sure.
DC also had a couple of things in other imprints going on. Road to Perdition, which we read a while ago when we looked at the movie. came out from Max Allan Collins. That was under the Paradox, DC Paradox line. And we actually lost an imprint I really liked. Helix Press, which had been the science fiction and sort of speculative fiction wing of DC Comics for a few years, was actually closed down. Some of its things, like Transmetropolitan, were folded into other DC lines like Vertigo. Others were simply dropped. The reason we found out was that it was deemed to be too intellectual for comic book fans, and people didn't buy them, and so because of that, they got rid of it. Which is painful to me.
I was going to say, this probably hits a little hard, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, it's unfortunate but true that especially in the 90s, there was an awful lot of really good, really cerebral, really well-written and literate comic book work that basically went completely unsold while everybody was buying Spawn and
Sure.
Battle Chasers and stuff like this. So it stinks. But yeah, so Helix sank this year.
What about over on the independent side and other smaller publishers?
So it was tough to sell things in '98, but there were some people who managed. Michael Turner came out with a new series called Fathom, and it's fantastic. Turner is just an amazing artist, or was an amazing artist. We lost him way too soon. He died relatively young, about a decade ago. But he had this story about a woman who was essentially sort of descended of this race from the ocean, and called Fathom. Basically, he's really good at drawing beautiful women, and so he made a series where pretty much all of the women are always in bikinis, and that was all you needed to sell many hundreds of thousands of copies of comic books.
Definitely not too intellectual there.
Still a format that works, by the way. So outside of that, Jim Lee started a new imprint actually called Cliffhanger, and he wanted to do this so he could use it to give a chance to some books that he thought were things he wanted to see or that he thought would be a good fit, but not necessarily within his other imprints. So he had a book called Battle Chasers by Joe Madureira, which actually becomes one of the most popular comics of the year. Basically, the top-selling books of the year are pretty much going to be X-Men books and Battle Chasers books, with a couple exceptions at the top. So that one sold really well.
So what is called? I was going to say, what is Battle Chasers then? I'm not familiar.
I'm not familiar either. It is actually a book I never actually read, but it's, I think, kind of an action team kind of book. It seemed like it was going to be a lot of fun. Joe Mad does just fantastic art, so mostly it wouldn't have mattered what it was about. It was just the fact that everything he drew was so cool. Yeah. But I actually, when I was looking through, because it's in a lot of the charts for this year, I really should have checked that out, but I have not done so. Danger Girl, on the other hand, another one he did, was actually a favorite of mine. It was sort of like James Bond, but if James Bond was just three really beautiful women who, again, ended up on adventures where they often ended up in bikinis or various states of undress. So it was very 90s.
I'm sensing a theme here, Dan.
You are not wrong. And then Crimson is the third one, and I don't know much about Crimson actually, but so Cliffhanger came out. It was going to be around for a while. Lee was still trying to do some different and interesting things, and Wildstorm actually gets folded into DC this year, so this gives him another place where he can still sort of play with new properties. We then also got 300 by Miller and Varley. So that's, of course, been turned into a movie, and it is something that's been lauded for decades now. It's a book that a lot of people really enjoy. It is very, very bloody. Varley's colors are fantastic in it. It is something that basically is larger than life in a lot of ways, but it's really a good story. Very different story from Frank Miller as well. We also had, you remember Will Eisner? You may have heard of him from the Eisner Awards.
Yes, familiar. The name does ring a bell.
It's just weird that he's, the Hall of Fame is named after him. He's in the Hall of Fame. And yet he just keeps bringing out new stuff that's in many cases better than the stuff people 50 years younger than him are doing. So he did a new book called A Family Matter. It came out this year. There's also a spirit anthology from Kitchen Sink, which allowed other people like Alan Moore and folks who are top names in comics to essentially play in the spirit universe. So Eisner gave his blessing to all these other people coming in and getting to use his character in this anthology. Which is also cool because, again, Eisner is like this living, breathing part of the comic ecosystem, even as he's a legend. It's literally like living in a world where God is walking around on Earth with you. And other creators can interact with him and hang out with him.
Nothing like, padding the resume even more on top of the fact that, you're already the best, arguably one of the best, and then you just keep putting out new stuff to further enhance that legacy.
It's really hard to argue. I mean, I love a lot of these other guys. I love Kirby. I love a lot of the guys who've been around for a long time. But Eisner basically, the Eisner Eiger studio helped to start comic books as we know them. And then he just dominated through the entire way of it. And he has this, through it all, kind of this belief in the comic book form, in the art form, and that you can use it for so many different things, And in some ways, he's one of those who talks about elevating it. I'm not always sure that I need the comic book form to be elevated. I think it just needs to be its own thing. But he was very much somebody who's like, I want this to be a respectable art form where I can walk in and say, I'm a comic book creator. And people will respect that at a New York dinner party instead of just wandering away from me embarrassed because they don't exactly know what to say about that. And so, but yeah, so he had a couple new things come out. The Buffyverse comes to comics at Dark Horse. So Buffy the Vampire Slayer, very big on TV at this point. Dark Horse gets the contract to adapt it. And Joss Whedon actually does some of the initial adaptation work with them. He will write some of the comic books as well. And so these books become sort of canon within the world. Oh. Much later on, we'll even get the 8th season of Buffy in comic book form. So the season that Wheaton had wanted to do that got canceled for whatever reason, he ends up doing in the comic books instead. A new comic strip called Jane's World, which debuted this year. It's one of the first comic strips that actually deals directly with sort of gay themes. And then we also had at the same point sort of an intersection, another book called Gay Comics, which came out in 1980 and has been by far the longest running sort of comic book for the gay community. Ended. So it started in 1980, ends in 1998. Other books that came out this year, Caricature by Daniel Close, Tales of Bosnia Soba by Joe Sacco. Again, he's kind of that guy who does these sort of almost like comic book journalism, and this is another harrowing sort of book that is fantastic. Penny Arcade by Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik debuts online. So this is going to be this is going to be the first big webcomic.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And they, of course, will then leverage this into all sorts of stuff, including a little convention called PAX that continues on to this day in like 3 or 4 different forms. So, but Penny Arcade begins in 1998. And then they'll move into not only being online, but also having print versions of it pretty quickly. So we will see those in comic book shops as well. And then also just wanted to note Age of Bronze by Eric Schanauer, which is a sort of a fictionalized history of the Trojan War by somebody who is very interested in getting the history right, who's also still a tremendous writer and a tremendous artist. So it's a one-man band. He did all of these himself. I think he's still making them, actually. It's taking forever because he's doing them all himself. But really, really good comic books. And they started coming out this year. So.
All right, well, let's look at sales and some of like the industry stuff. You mentioned that Jim Lee, the Wildstorm, is being kind of folded into DC, so that's part of that. What's going on as far as like comic book shops, and then like who's actually what is the breakdown on some of like the like sales in 1998?
Well, so first off, the news is not great. So after, years of sales declining and then sales declining and sales declining, this year sales continued to decline. So it's just a path to nowhere we're on here.
Sure.
Essentially, sales in 1997 to comic shops were about 244 million, fell to 226 million, which is about a 10% drop again in 98. A number of additional shops closed, so we're down to somewhere in the area of 3,500 shops, comic book shops in America at this point, which seems like a lot, but when you think of how many towns there are in America, that really limits the reach of people being able to get to this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
25 of the top 31 issues for this year were X-Men titles. So when people were buying comic books, they were buying X-Men pretty much, right? This is why Helix can't get a break in the comic book shop market, evidently.
Right.
The number 1 and 2 spots, so were actually taken by Fathom, that book by Michael Turner we talked about, and then Witchblade, another like a Top Cow book that again Mark Silvestri comes in, does the artwork on it. Fantastic. Another one with a female lead. So really some good stuff in the comic market there. It is weird though, because 1 year after losing out to DC, Marvel, just by not going bankrupt, pops back up to the number 1 spot. So they're at about 26% of all comic sales. DC's at about 25%. Image 14%. And then you go down to Dark Horse at about 5%. Wizard, which isn't really even a comics books company, at 3.8%. Viz, which does essentially like manga type products, would be 1.7%. Chaos, which is going to be just 1 or 2 titles, it's going to do the Evil Ernie stuff and things like that, is actually the 7th highest publisher with 1.3%, which means that the market at this point is almost entirely top heavy with DC and Marvel and Image. So you're talking 50, 65% or so is just these 3 companies. And then a bunch of other ones. About 18% are in the other, which is somewhere under 1%.
Yeah,
of the market.
Less than 1%.
Yep. So it's again a Marvel world, and everybody else is just living in it.
It is crazy to me that the stumble, I guess, is all it ends up being for Marvel. They had 1 year where they weren't the top spot for like the last, 2 decades.
Keep in mind, though, that it's a stumble, but basically they're actually falling. It's just everyone else is falling down the stairs with them, and they happen to be the last one down, so they're still on top. So it's, because their sales are still plummeting. It's just that they're still ahead because everybody else is losing with them. So
let's talk about new things and things that came to an end this year. It looks like we also have some people that we need to remember that passed away in 1998 as well.
Absolutely, yep. So we have basically Bob Kane, of course, the fellow who had who took credit for creating Batman. We're going to call it that way at this point. Whether Bill Finger and a bunch of other guys, Jerry Robinson, they've all got arguments to make on that. But in any case, he's the guy who more than anyone was associated with Batman, passed away at 83. Bill Ward, we lost at 79. He'd done a book called Torchy and a lot of Good Girl art and the like back like in the World War II era. Probably if you saw his art, you would recognize it. But Joe Orlando of EC. So Joe Orlando actually did some work on Daredevil back in the day. In fact, I believe he was the artist on Daredevil #1. We also saw an awful lot of him with EC, though he sort of pioneered the EC science fiction books and the like, that whole line. So he was 79 as well. So a lot of the old guard guys who made their bones in the 40s and 50s we're starting to lose now. Other than that, we also had some companies coming and going. So one big thing is Tokyo Pop actually starts its U.S. operations. They're going to become a massive publisher of manga in the United States market, both in bookstores and in comic shops. They started this year with mostly Sailor Moon reprints. That's kind of where they get things going initially. Humanoid starts up. They do a lot of reprints of stuff from, say, like France and other European markets. Oni Press actually finally gets things into shops. Technically, I think we talked about them starting up last year, but their first books actually to make comic shops was this year. They're going to still be going, doing good stuff. The presses we lose, a lot of them are on sort of the seedier side of the comic industry. Right. So, Ripoff Press, which is one of the classic underground comics, like Robert Crumb and all those guys all used to publish through Ripoff Press. They actually closed after 30 years. So 68 Wow. They would have started, and they've been around through pretty much everything, but this year they finally do end up folding. We lose Angel Entertainment, which started just a couple of years ago with their sort of softcore comic books. Penthouse Comic Books ends, and we actually find out that Fantagraphics is having trouble continuing to publish all the books at once because, and a lot of people say it's because of internet porn taking over the market from magazines. Their Eros line, which had previously been used to fund their more respectable books, is having trouble with sales, and that's making it difficult for them to balance the books. So they kind of had a two-headed system where they published the smut to make enough money that they could then publish the sort of premier, type of books. And unfortunately, that model starts to have trouble this year. We also kind of finally lose Leafield's Awesome Comics. Their financing disappears, so he's going to have a tough time maintaining that. And you kind of start to feel for him. But our man Jim Shooter, all these comic companies he started.
Yes.
He publishes a few books and then they fail. Uh-huh. This year he actually started a company called Daring Comics that never even got to the point of publishing one book before it folded.
Oh no.
So he actually lost a comic company without really even ever getting a single page out to the public. But so yeah, even so, this was a really stable year in terms of what we've been seeing from comics over the last while. Partly that's just because there aren't that many publishers left because they've all folded. But we only had about 20 total comic companies that started up this year and only about 20 that closed this year. So compared to the volatility of the 80s and 90s, this was a very, very stable year.
Definitely. Let's move on and let's talk about the Eisners for 1998. There's a lot of familiar names here.
There really are. A lot of the stuff is dominated by books that you maybe heard of. Matt Wagner and Tim Sale win Best Short Story for Grindel Black and White. Grindel Black and White also wins Best Anthology Book. DC wins Best Single Issue for Hitman number 34 by Garth Ennis. Usagi Yojimbo wins. Preacher wins. 300 gets that Best Limited Series. Inhumans by Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee wins Best New Series. We'll talk about that. Marvel actually won an Eisner.
Yes,
Can you believe it?
Stop the presses! Stop the presses!
It's kind of crazy. Best title for younger audience, Batman: The Gotham Adventures, kind of has that sewn up. When Bone isn't winning it, they are.
Right.
Best humor population, my man Gru, one of my favorite characters of all time, wins that one. And then best graphic album was that Superman Peace on Earth by Paul Dini and Alex Ross. So other than that, as far as individuals winners, we had Kurt Busiek, Frank Miller, Kyle Baker. Kyle Baker's kind of a fun sort of cartoony artist who won for You Are Here from DC and Vertigo. Alex Ross won Best Painter, of course. Best Colorist went to Varley for her 300 work. Best Letterer, stop me if you've already heard this, Todd Klein wins for Best Lettering. Best Cover Artist, Brian Boland. And Talent Deserving of Wider Recognition, Brian Michael Bendis. And this is the last year that you would be able to say that he is deserving of wider recognition.
I was going to say, that seems like... I've heard of him, and so he apparently does in fact get wider recognition after this year.
If only he could take over a beloved character who's recently had his title, rebooted, and bring about maybe 10 years of some of the best comics that have ever been written, then yes, he'd be fine. Now this is the weird thing is, we are at the point where Bendis has been doing things like Jinx and Goldfish and Torso, sort of writing and drawing his own books. And now he's going to turn into just a writer, and he's going to depend on people like Michael A. Van Oming and David Mack. And he's going to find all these great artists and let them just sort of do the art and turn into sort of the writer of the decade for the 2000s. So it's kind of crazy.
No, and for the Hall of Fame, we got some inductees into the Hall of Fame this year as well.
It's a big year for the Hall of Fame. We got Murphy Anderson, Jack Cole, L.B. Cole, Bill Finger, Gardner Fox, Matt Rayboy, Alex Schomburg, Joe Simon, Art Spiegelman, and Dick Sprang. And that is a very eclectic grouping. Most of them are older guys, but Spiegelman is really not that old at this point. He would be probably 10 to 20 years younger than most of the other guys he went in with. A lot of these dudes like Anderson and Fox and Sprang, Finger, Cole, worked a lot for DC Comics back in the 50s and 60s, and sort of, were defining on characters like Hawkman and things like that. So it's a good group. It's definitely a little different than, our first couple of years, though. They're starting to get to people who you've probably never seen anything by any of these guys because we've never really read any of these books.
Yeah. I mean, I recognized Art Spiegelman's name.
Spiegelman,
that was the only name on that list that actually jumped out to me that I recognized.
Jack Cole is probably, other than Spiegelman, is my favorite of these guys. His Plastic Man stuff was pretty fantastic.
All right, let's wrap up the year in comics by telling us, Dan, what was your favorite non-Marvel comic in 1998?
I had two very different answers. My guilty pleasure was Danger Girl, which was fantastic. J. Scott Campbell's art was hilarious and beautiful, and it was just a really fun title. And then Age of Bronze, as a history major and somebody who's always been interested in like Greece and Rome and that sort of thing, it's just a fantastic book. I've been following that ever since it started, and actually have to go and see now if I've missed anything, because it's easy to miss when new issues come out, because they only happen like once every 2 years. So it's wonderful, though, and I started that right at the beginning and have really enjoyed them.
All right, that is a look at the wide lens of comics in 1998. I think it's time we move on and talk about the year that Marvel had, including an Eisner. The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, Dan, they survived the bankruptcy, and we had kind of a rock bottom year in 1997. Does the bottom fall out even more this year, or do we actually start to see them level out, or do they possibly even start to inch their way back up again?
So, I mean, sales are bad, right?
Right.
Because of the fact that they have two things working against them in terms of sales and profitability. The first is they're publishing about half as many books as they did previously, which is going to make it hard to sell as many comics, right?
Right.
But then secondly, they've just lost a lot of momentum over the last few years. That said, Marvel has now been taken over by Toy Biz early in the year, and we don't necessarily love the Toy Biz execs, like Avi Arad comes in, those guys, but they do sort of bring a little bit of stability. Some of their policies I cannot support. Things like, still the counting staples and all that. They actually removed free coffee from the bullpen. So how taking away people's coffee is going to improve productivity, I have no idea. But basically, a lot of the sort of austerity measures that they bring in are not helping them at all in terms of getting people to want to work for them. But there are still enough reasons to come work for Marvel. They're still the ones where you've got the best chance of making some money, that they do actually get some pretty good people back. One of the austerity measures, though, that does bother me is they canned something called Marvel Kids. Marvel Kids was the sort of brainchild of a woman named Jackie Carter, who was working for Marvel at the time. Her position was cut, along with a bunch of other people who were fired when Toy Biz took over. And one of the things she was working on was a partnership with Scholastic, the school publisher, to get Marvel Comics into schools through the Scholastic Books programs. And considering how we've lost an entire generation of kids on comics at this point, this would have been a fantastically important thing. Yeah. Keep in mind also that 1998, when they fired her, is about the same year when Scholastic published the first Harry Potter book.
Oh, goodness.
So Marvel could have gotten themselves into the Scholastic book order form the same time as Harry Potter went in. And that worked out fine for,
I was
Rowling.
going to say, that it sort of feels like that lost generation of comic book fans are those Harry Potter fans.
Almost certainly. And a few years from now, we'll be talking about the fact that the same deal that essentially Marvel wanted, or that Jackie Carter was trying to pitch to Scholastic, Scholastic realized that they wanted in on the comic book market, and they pitched that deal to Jeff Smith and Bone. And Bone became sort of that sitting next to Harry Potter one. It's actually not to get too contemporary because we don't know when people are going to be listening to these, but there's a guy named Matt with like 3 or 4 T's, who's a comic YouTuber, who just did recently an episode on Bone and Jeff Smith, talking about how Scholastic sort of took over the comic book or graphic novel market for kids, with Bone as sort of a lead-in, and then went on to the Dab Pilkey and the Raina Tegelmeier and all of these sorts of folks, and Marvel just got left behind. And if they hadn't canned her, they hadn't fired her, and they had left the coffee, they may have made many, many cups of coffee and additional funds that they would have been able to get off that. Anyway,
let's talk about number of series, new series coming in, and like one shots and stuff like that. So
we are down to 188 total series this year.
Okay.
139 of them are brand new this year, meaning that only about less than 50 series actually came in from 1997 or earlier.
Yeah.
141 series ended. So, and that makes some sense because we had a massive number of one-shots. We had 87 one-shots, or 46%, almost half of all the series Marvel published this year, were one issue, just a collected edition or a single comic type of thing. Mm-hmm. ongoing series, there were 56 of them, which is only 30%. So a very low number of actual, these are series that we want to build around and move on into the future.
So what about the year's like crossover event or their big events? What's going on this year with regards to that?
We had Identity Crisis with Spider-Man. We had The Gathering of Five, which was also Spider-Man. Other than that, what's really going on to a certain extent is we've got an awful lot of new books coming out. So we get a new Fantastic Four published, written by Scott Dobdell and drawn by Alan Davis. And Davis is one of my favorite artists, so I really enjoyed those. I think he only lasted like 3 issues on it, though, before he was replaced.
Okay.
New Captain America with Mark Waid and Ron Garney. New Avengers book with Kurt Busiek and George Perez. And this was something that Perez had drawn Avengers back in the day. Everybody loves him on Team Books. Everybody loves him on Avengers. So this was celebrated by the fans. There's also another book Busiek wrote called Avengers Forever, drawn by Carlos Pacheco. New Iron Man book comes out, again written by Kurt Busiek, this time with art by a newcomer named Sean Chen, who's a really, really good artist. Later in the year, Mighty Thor comes out, rebooting the Thor series. Dan Jurgens is writing it, John Romita Jr. on art. The main thing about all of these is every one of these titles is rebooted with a name that is essentially not one of the Image guys or somebody who is a, really hot new artist from someplace else. It's not J. Scott Campbell brought in or whatever. It's professionals who had made their bones working in the Marvel and DC ecosystem, essentially, who everybody knew who they were and were comfortable with them. So this was really they did all of the Heroes Reborn stuff. They rebooted the universe. They canceled a ton of stuff. They canceled the series. And this was really an attempt to sort of say, we're going to calm things down, bring it all kind of back to the way that you know the Marvel Universe, and just sort of let you enjoy that for a while. And it worked. All of these books were really successful with fans because this is sort of comfort food in terms of comic books.
Trying to remember, have I read any Kurt Busiek books? Because, obviously it was his year. He had a couple Avengers books and a new Iron Man book this year.
I don't know if we have read much Busiek stuff. He's the guy who did Astro City, which is a book I love. But a lot of the stuff we read was either things from the 70s that were setting characters up, or stuff from the later 2000s, which were where a lot of the things from the movies came from. And then I don't believe he's written any Moon Knight, and I don't think he's written any Daredevil.
Correct.
So
yeah. Is he definitely somebody I should try and read something of?
You will, if you're around for a while and we keep doing stuff, you will eventually run into Kurt Busiek.
Okay.
He's a really good writer. I would say that the primary thing is Astro City is sort of his masterpiece, and the first few volumes of that are absolutely fantastic. They're if you think of a shiny, happy version of The Boys, that would be the easiest reference I could give you.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah. It's like a rethinking of the Justice League and all of these heroes, but it's in a much more positive kind of environment.
Yeah. All right. So what's going on with the Hulk?
Peter David leaves. He's been on the title for a decade. One of the longest runs on almost any Marvel title by a writer. And evidently there was some meddling with the new folks who came in, some things they wanted to do that he didn't like, and so he left. And something like 6 months later, the Hulk is just canceled. So one of the other longest running books that had survived, kind of like Daredevil, also gets the knife. And so the only other thing after that, Spider-Girl does get her own series. She was introduced late the previous year. It's written by Tom DeFalco, drawn by Pat Olaf, as part of this Marvel Comics 2. we'll see a lot of new characters from Marvel Comics too. It's actually the sort of separate universe where May Parker, where Spider-Girl exists as the daughter of Mary Jane and Peter, who's grown up. She's like a teenager. She's got powers, etc. And so there's other versions of all the other Marvel characters out there as well. The conceit behind that essentially is that the Marvel sort of the Marvel age started a bit earlier there. And so because of that, Spider-Man was born earlier, and now his daughter's already a teenager. But yeah, so there's 3 or 4 books from that they bring out, and those are pretty well received. Most of them end up getting canceled. Spider-Girl is almost canceled, but the fan reception on it was strong enough that even though it didn't seem to make a lot of money, there were so many people who just loved it, of the people who were reading it, that they continued on with it for quite a while.
Okay, so you mentioned that the Hulk got his book canceled, and that it was one of those last surviving books along with Daredevil. As we talked about in the outset, Daredevil didn't survive this year either, and
No, it did
something late in the year came up called Marvel Knights. What is Marvel Knights?
Well, if you remember Marvel Edge from a couple of years ago, where they were like, "Oh, Daredevil's going to be edgier now," and they gave him the new suit and everything else. This is kind of the same thing. They again wanted to take a lot of the street level heroes and move them off kind of into their own imprint, so that they can take off the comics code. They can make them more sort of more brutal, or tell tougher stories, that sort of thing. The first 3 titles are Inhumans with Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee. That's that one that wins Best New Series. Fantastic, fantastic storyline. We read the initial Inhumans books by Jack Kirby, and I remember that you were like, "Oh man, don't ever make me do this again." We could have read these Inhumans books, and you'd have been much happier. Black Panther was rebooted by Christopher Priest, Mark Teixeira, and Joe Quesada. This is a seminal edition of Black Panther. Like, this is when the Black Panther from the movie, the MCU Black Panther, sort of arrives. So this is where we get the Dora Milaje. It's where we get Everett K. Ross, or whatever his name is. Everett Ross comes in. A lot of things about the modern Black Panther start here. Christopher Priest's run is fantastic. We then also get Daredevil, rebooted, partly and specifically because Kevin Smith agrees to write it. So I think they decided to make a big deal of it, so they canceled Daredevil. They start a new #1. They put Smith on it, along with Joe Quesada, who does a fantastic job on art. And This book is off and running. So those are the 3 Marvel Knights titles.
I'm going to mention it now, but next week when we get into talking about Daredevil, we are going to mention Volume 2, which starts in November, and we get the first 2 books of Kevin Smith's run. But we're not going to talk about it next week. We're going to talk about it 2 weeks after, in 1999, because the first story arc Kevin Smith does is called Guardian Devil, and it's 8 books. And it basically ends up being like the main story of 1999. So there's going to be a lot to talk about with Kevin Smith and Daredevil, but we're going to wait a couple weeks till we do that. But this was... I did not realize that Kevin Smith had written comic books. Like, I knew that he's a comic book guy, obviously, but I did not realize that he had actually written some comic books. And so when I moved over, going from Volume 1 to Volume 2, and saw that his name was on it, I'm like, wow, this is crazy. I didn't realize this.
Yep. That he did some Green Arrow stuff as well. He's been on some other things here and there. The problem is, as you may have noticed, he doesn't necessarily get 12 scripts out dependably every year. So there may be less than a full year of books of Daredevil the next couple of years. So we'll see how that goes. So, and then the last thing is just to note that there is actually one other book published this year, one other story that it's joined a select few comic books in Marvel history. It's called Spider-Man Chapter 1, and it is essentially like, when Frank Miller did his Batman Year Ones, and he did, the Daredevil sort of Year One type stuff. They did a Spider-Man Chapter 1, which retold a lot of Spider-Man's continuity and changed some things. People hated it. And it's actually one of the few comics that literally just sort of has been swept under the rug and everyone just pretends it didn't happen. Kind of like the Death of Echo book that we read from Moon Knight back in the day. That everybody was just like, that was awful, here's Echo. And then they just moved on without really even explaining it. So most of Marvel's continuity somehow or another does all remain in a line, no matter how outlandish it is. This one did kind of just get retconned without even bothering to retcon it. People just ignore it. So there you go.
There you go. Let's jump in and let's talk about some of the new series that got started that actually did have some lasting impact. What looks like, obviously, you had mentioned a new. I was going to say, it looks like a lot of these titles that you've mentioned so far that got rebooted or started new this year ended up hanging around for a little while.
Yep, that's why this 1998, it looks bad because we're losing all of this money. Sales are still bad, but they reconnected with their audiences and they stabilized themselves in terms of kind of righting the ship. So Fantastic Four debuted this year. This Volume 2 is going to go 159 issues. Daredevil Volume 2 is going to go 132 issues. Spider-Girl 101. Iron Man 89, as well as Avengers, also 89. Thor 85. Black Panther 62. Cap 50. Mutant X 32. X-Men the manga goes for 26 issues even. And then there's a few that had some troubles. Stingers did not last too terribly long. That Spider-Man Chapter 1 went 13 and then was shelved forever. Inhumans was actually just a limited series, but it was 12 issues. And then there's a number of the other ones like A-Next and J2. Those were the other books in the Spider-Girl universe. And most of those did not last that long. But I mean, really, if you look at it, to have almost 10 books that went 50 issues, that's a nice year. Now, they needed that because they'd canceled everything. So something's got to hit the shelves, right?
Presumably you can't live on just one-shots alone.
No. So, but nonetheless, it was a nice reboot for them.
So what about limited series? Were there any that had sort of a lasting impact? You mentioned the Inhumans one that went about a dozen issues. Were there any others that are big or considered to be, very important as far as characters?
Avengers Forever was incredibly well received. Pacheco's just a fantastic artist, and that was a really good story. Sunfire and Big Hero 6. Big Hero 6 obviously made into an animated film. Doesn't look anything like the Big Hero 6 that's in the comic book. Baymax in this is like a big green sort of goblin monster. And in the movie, he's like, a marshmallow. But nonetheless, the basic concept comes from there. There was a bunch of others. Dracula, Lord of the Undead was kind of fun. They brought out a Blade limited series. Of course, with the movie there, trying to get a little bit of that. We had a Moon Knight 4-issue limited series.
I was going to ask you, which one is this?
This is the one that brings him back from the dead, where Morpheus is involved. Do you remember that weirdness?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Because he'd been killed off at the end of like the last time we saw him, and then they bring back Doug Mensch, and he's just like, let's just forget any of that happened.
That's right.
And we move on and kind of have a little change. Other than that, there's a lot of things that kind of call back on previous things, like, Wolverine Days of Future Past, that sort of stuff. And then there are some Star Trek things. So they're getting a few more licensed properties in, that sort of thing. But, yeah, again, I think the thing is, not a lot of really new stuff. A lot of this is them going back to characters people know and characters they can kind of depend on being able to sell.
Right. Do ending series, or do you want to do the new characters first?
I'm fine with either one.
So with all these new books, both on the limited side and these reboots, it was going back to characters we knew, but were there any actual new characters that showed up? I mean, you mentioned that the Black Panther series had a pretty big impact as far as where it is now.
I would say that with a bullet, Okeye and the Dora Milaje are the number one new characters of 1998. But besides that, Big Hero 6, we did have new versions of Silver Samurai, Honey Lemon, Go-Go Tamago, Hiro Takachi, Go-Go Tamago. We had Hero, Baymax, Sunfire was already there. But so that team, A-Next, and pretty much that whole universe, the Marvel Comics 2 universe, was created this year for the most part. So Thunderstrike, who's kind of a version of Thor, Slinger, Mainframe, J2, American Dream, all sorts of characters like that. So not a great year in terms of characters, but we do have one or two really important ones.
Sure. All right, well, we had more series that ended this year than began this year. We mentioned Daredevil as one of those, and Hulk as another one of those. What else came to an end this year that we should note?
Essentially, this year we're going to lose Amazing Spider-Man. We're going to lose at issue 443, Spectacular Spider-Man at issue 265, Spider-Man at issue 100, Sensational Spider-Man at 35, Spider-Man Unlimited at 22. So that's a lot of ongoing Spider-Mans getting canceled. Yeah. And what this really shows is that Marvel, with all of the other stuff they're doing right, where we talked about the Avengers and all of these kind of getting their ships righted, Spider-Man is one of their most important characters, and they had no idea what to do with him. The Clone Saga that they'd done with Ben Reilly and all of this stuff, and moving Peter off to Oregon and all of that, had just completely screwed up everything that people kind of thought about Spider-Man. And the books were just hemorrhaging fans. And so those all went away. Daredevil goes away, but of course is immediately rebooted. X-Factor, which is an X-Men book, ends at 150. Silver Surfer ends at 148. Excalibur, another X book, ends at 126. That was a really good series. I was sad to see go. What If ended at 115. Ghost Rider at 94. That's a lot of books at the almost decade mark, ending in 1 year. We also lost Marvel Vision. Elektra went 20 issues and went down. Journey into Mystery at 20. Kazar at 20. 3 Star Trek books. Starfleet Academy was 20 issues. Early Voyages 17. Deep Space Nine 15. No, 4. Star Trek Voyager 15 issues. No, 5. Star Trek Unlimited 10 issues. So basically the entire Star Trek, world, maybe they lost the license. But it was a bad year in that way for closings, because they lost a lot of books that had been very popular for a long time.
Yeah, that was surprising to see. Like, I was trying to think. I thought last year they canceled a couple Spider-Man books too. So like over the 2 years, they've like completely, like, it seemed like every year in the early 90s they were adding a Spider-Man book, and then all of a sudden now we have to basically kill them all because they're all none
Well,
of them are performing apparently anymore.
I think it was some of the kids ones, like maybe Spider-Man Adventures and some things like that, went last year. But this year, I mean, that's Amazing, Spectacular are the two sort of flagship Spider-Man titles.
Yeah.
And then that Spider-Man itself is the one that they started with McFarlane in the, right before he took off for Image. So these are big books.
Right. Well, let's talk about the bullpen then. What does the bullpen look like? Who's our editor in chief? And looks like we have a passing specifically with regards to a Marvel creator.
Sure. Yep. So Bob Harris is still our editor in chief right now. That is not going to last forever. He is nearing thin ice. Bill Jimmis is coming in as a publisher, and he will be there for a while. He actually came over from sort of, I think it was Fleer. Maybe it was Panini, but I think it was Fleer. But he's a card guy who also was a fan of comics. Eventually he even writes some comic books and things like that. The staff size this year is 531, which is down a lot from what we had before. You remember we had years with 700, 800, 900 people getting credits.
Right.
And the staff is almost smaller than the number of titles a few years ago, which is kind of crazy. And
Yes.
and new staff, we had 103 people get their first credit for Marvel this year. So outside of that, you mentioned the passings. We did lose Archie Goodwin this year, who is somebody who was much beloved in the comic industry. He was 60 years old when he died. This is a guy who had been with Marvel for a long time. He had been a writer on stuff like Manhunter over at DC. He came over to Marvel and I think he was editor-in-chief for a while. He was a group editor for a long time. He also ran the Epic line and was sort of the leading voice behind that. If you remember, that was the time when Shooter was alienating all of the best talent. And
Yes.
then Archie Goodwin was the guy who had the job of somehow convincing them they could still work for Marvel, and he would shield them from Shooter. And they all loved Goodwin, so they came over and worked for him. So sad, a sad one there. He was too young, obviously.
Right. So Rookie of the Year time, 1998. Seems like there should be a decent number of candidates. 103 people getting a new writing credit this year. Who were some of the people that were in consideration?
So, just because we'll mention him because he's the person most people in America would know of these guys. Kevin Smith, you likely already know this guy.
Yes.
The director of
Familiar.
Dogma and other classics. So he's considered only in that I want to mention him so people know I didn't forget him. But he's only written I think these 8 Marvel stories in his entire life. So probably coming in and doing that does not necessarily make you the Rookie of the Year, especially with some of the people we've got instead. Sean Chen, mentioned him already. He had a long run on Iron Man. He also worked on Wolverine, Elektra. He's still working for Marvel on all sorts of things. He does art, and then I think he also does production design and things like this. So he's someone who would definitely be a good choice. Been with the company a long time, done a lot of really good work. Javier Pulido worked on Star Trek, Hulk, X-Men, Cap, Spider-Man, Black Cat, and you have read some of his stuff because his work with Charles Soule was one of the She-Hulk books that we read back when we were getting ready for the She-Hulk TV series. So,
Right.
That's
right.
Really a good artist. His stuff's a little bit more cartoony. It's a lot of fun, but so he's also been around for a long time. But I think our winner has to be Joe Casey, and he's been writing for Marvel for a long time. He actually co-created America Chavez, who's one of the characters that's now, been in the MCU, has been looking like she might be a big part of some of the future stuff if they're going to do Young Avengers things, that sort of stuff. She's a part of the Young Avengers. He wrote X-Men, he wrote Cable, Hulk. He's also worked at Marvel Animation and was one of the people behind Ultimate Spider-Man and some of the other things. Also, he's a personal favorite of mine because he wrote this really weird book called Godland, or Godland, with Tom Scioli, which is kind of like the closest you could get to a Jack Kirby, Stan Lee Fantastic Four story in the 2000s. So it was really a lot of fun. So I'm going to go with Joe Casey as my Rookie of the Year for this year.
All right, we have a Rookie of the Year, Joe Casey. Congratulations, 1998. Dan, as we're wrapping things up and heading out the door, what is your favorite Marvel comic for 1998?
I am so embarrassed by this, but there is no question at all that I was so excited about the Kevin Smith Daredevil. I cannot tell you how pumped I was for the Kevin Smith Daredevil. It was it's a long summer in 1999 waiting for those issues, let me tell you. So you just get to read them sequentially on Marvel Unlimited. I and others in the late 90s did not have that pleasure. So, but yeah, I would say that I enjoyed some of the other stuff that came out this year. I liked a lot of the reboots, but that was the book I most looked forward to was Kevin Smith's turn on my Daredevil books.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, I think we're not gonna, like I said, we're not gonna talk a ton about the Kevin Smith books next week because that is 1999. But there's some interesting things to talk about with Daredevil because they had to wrap up that first volume, and we got to see this really weird story with him in France. We got the return of Danji Chichester to the series as well. So there was a lot of interesting things that happened that we're going to get to talk about. And then I think we actually do need to kind of put a bow on Volume 1, don't we?
Yep, that's. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. I am looking forward to just talking about the series as a whole and the highs and lows of it and what some of the things you remember and enjoyed were. So it's pretty exciting. Been a long journey. Long journey, Dwayne.
I'm telling you, when I started reading Daredevil at issue 1 and I knew there was 300 and some odd books in this volume, I'm just like, I don't think I'm ever going to actually get to the end of it. But I have reached the end of it. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about, and we will definitely be doing that all next week. So until then, that is going to wrap it up for us for this week. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. Now, if you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That's going to help other new listeners find the show that much easier. Now, whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts on this week's show. You can send us those comments via email. That address is comments@comicsovertime.com, or you can reach out via social media. We are on X or Blue Sky @comicsovertime. Dan, this was interesting. Lots of stuff I didn't remember. Lots of new stuff that I need to probably go out and try and look for. And next week, you've got a lot of Daredevil to talk about.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Right. Until next week, take care, everybody.
See you later, folks.